just testing. Hello, everyone. This is Chappy Dodia, and I have Jose Paez and Ashok joining us today for today's PowerVog webinar. Today, we're going to be covering AIX and IBM on the IBM Cloud. And without further ado, let me hand over to Jose so he can introduce himself, and perhaps Ashok can introduce himself as well, and then we can start the webinar. I'm going to mute everyone, so Jose and Ashok, if you can unmute yourself before you start.
Sure.
That's great. Jose, are you ready?
Yes. Sorry. Hello, my name is Jose Paez, and I'm the offering manager for this offering that we're going to talk about today, which is AIX and IBM on IBM's public cloud. And I'm joined with Ashok. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ashok. I work in development in Power Systems. Many of you know me from other system management products, such as the hardware management console, the cloud management console. But now, as with the industry, we move on to the cloud, and I'm going to talk about infrastructure management of the cloud. Great.
So I'll start from the beginning. Let me see if I can. There we go. With the problem statement that we saw from systems, what we started to see and hear from our client base was that cloud capabilities were becoming a prereq for consuming any sort of IT resources, and we as systems, we have a very large client base that was using and depending on AIX or IBM resources. But internally from systems, we didn't offer any AIX or IBM capabilities in the cloud today. While we do have very similar offerings out there, and I wanted to list a few of them and talk about their differences, this offering is a true cloud offering, and when I say that, I mean it's fully flexible, it's metered by the hour and charged to you at the end of the month. So it is a true cloud offering. We have other things out there right now like PowerAid Bare Metal, which is renting out the actual hardware. This is different than that. This is just renting out an instance that you create, not an actual entire box. We do have some of our software on the cloud with Power AI and IBM's public cloud. A few of our business partners have seen the gap in the market and hosted their own environments. Something like SkyTap is kind of filling in that space. And we do have IBM I, again, with a monthly charge. And then Power and I with GPUs is a new initiative that's going to be coming out soon. So these are all offerings that are either out now or that last one's coming out soon that are slightly different than what we're talking about, just because of mostly around the flexibility and how you customize an instance. And I'll get more deeper into that in a few minutes. So this is kind of our roadmap right now going into the cloud. The first step was, establishing what IBM Cloud Private looks like, being able to set up that network, and now the first step into the public cloud is giving the AIX and IBM capabilities out of the IBM Cloud Catalog, and we know a lot of the workloads run on that. And then we start to move into what I mentioned previously with the Power 9 with the GPUs, which is next gen cloud. This is when we become more deeply integrated into the entire IBM public cloud network, and we have our scale up P9s with AIX and IBM just integrated into that. So let's talk about the solution. The offering name is IBM Power Systems Virtual Server on IBM Cloud. It's a long name. The description can be summarized fairly succinctly, though. It gives the user the ability to spin up an AIX or IBM I instance on IBM's public cloud. So you go into the IBM public cloud, you customize your instance, you choose how many cores, how much memory, how much storage, what OS you want, and you can create that instance in the public cloud. We as IBM, we manage up to the OS deployment, so we consider this a very bare IaaS solution for us. From there, the client would self-manage from the OS and up. Everything is purchasable through the IBM Cloud Marketplace. It is available right now, so we GA'd, I want to say, a month ago now. So you're able to go to cloud.ibm.com if you have an account. If not, you can create an account. And search for power, and Ashok's going to walk us through what that all looks like, but you can go in there and customize an image to see kind of what that would cost. So the systems that we've put into these data centers, and that's how kind of we're spreading it out. We've gone into a few different data centers, and we've dropped in some Power 9 and Power 8 boxes. So you can choose from an S922 or an E880 whenever you're customizing your instance. When you do customize your instance, you're able to select up to a quarter of a core, up to 143 cores. From there, you can choose whether it's dedicated or shared. What this means is that if that resource, that core resource, is dedicated to you or shared, this is a multi-tenant environment, so there are multiple people on a box, and dedicated would just give you the ability to make sure that all those resources, no matter what is happening or how much usage that box is seeing, will always be dedicated to your user. From memory, you can choose from 8 to 64 gigabytes per core. Now, we've tied it to cores so that we don't have any stranded cores, and let's say somebody comes in and tries to take in all the memory and not take out any cores. We've tied them to each other, so if you take 64 gigabytes per core and looking at the maximum amount of cores, 143, you're looking around 9 terabytes of possible memory. The storage type that we have is Tier 3 HDD and Tier 1 SSD. It's all V7000 fiber attached storage. The quantities are 10 gigabyte minimum and 2 terabyte maximum per disk. So if you increase your disk, you can increase your storage amount. The operating systems that we're running are AIX and IBM I. In the GUI, if you're spinning up a brand new instance, you can create, you can take a version of the latest AIX and IBM I, so 7.1, 7.2 for AIX, 7.2, 7.3 for IBM I, going into 7.4 coming up soon. There are a few caveats in the OSs that I like to talk about. So the first one being that we do have a bring your own image capability. So if you have worked on an image on-prem and you'd like to roll that into the cloud, you can do so. The only thing is you have to watch the version number of your AIX or IBM I instance. The only reason I say that is because due to the hardware, there are some support limitations. So let's say you're trying to bring in an AIX 5 dot something into a Power 9 box. That is not something that is supported. So you're not going to see that same level of support. The other thing I like to talk about when I say there's caveats is that when it comes to bringing your own image, we do have a bring your own image capability, but we don't have a bring your own license. So when you do bring your own image, you're not rolling over that license. It's just going to be bundled up in the cost of bring your own image for running that instance on the cloud. I do have this chart here of all the different pricing metrics for this offering. While a lot of this is piecemeal, so the way it works is when you come into the offering, it's kind of like a cocktail of things. You're able to choose and pick what you want, and then through that you're building out your offering. So it's going to be a mixture of all these things. You can get a really good idea of it when you go to the cloud.ibm.com. Again, Ashok's going to walk us through what that looks like, and you can start to price out your own instances if you're curious on what a certain loadout looks like. Again, this is a lot of the same things that we talked about here. So this is a co-owned offering when it comes to systems. We're working very closely with our cloud counterparts to make sure that this is going to market with all the needs of not only our systems clients, but also the needs and expectations of cloud clients. We talked about the S922s and the E880s. We are looking at putting in E980s as we start to build out the offering into further geos. All of this is purchasable through the IBM Cloud Marketplace. You can do that through the UI or through the command line. It's very flexible. Again, you're selecting cores, types of core storage, operating system, and you're charged by the hour. You are billed at the end of the month, but you're still charged hourly. We've so far gone live in the U.S., so we have U.S. East and South availability. That's Washington, D.C., and Dallas is where we have our data centers. And our next expansion is into Frankfurt at the end of 3Q. And from Frankfurt, we're looking at moving into a few other geos. We continue our expansion to geos based on demand that we hear from those geo leaders. So here's a little timeline. So we had our beta and we went live in June. Again, giving us U.S. East and South availability. Then we're starting to push into Frankfurt. That's where we're going to start to maybe start inputting the E980s in that data center. And then we have certain, I listed these post-GA functionalities and compliances just to talk to our relationship with our MSPs and our clients. So as working so closely with our MSPs and our clients, we hear a lot of functionalities that are necessary for their business critical operations to continue. And something like Terraform providers, something that we're working to bring to market. And it is crucial for our MSPs to have something like Terraform provider, just so that they can have that automation as part of this offering and deliver at a large scale. Also, we've got HIPAA readiness that we plan to be completed by Q3. When you have an IaaS offering, so an infrastructure as a service offering, you're going across almost all the industries. So healthcare, finance, government. All these industries come with their own set of regulations and compliances that we need to meet. That's why we've had to roadmap some of these things out. And if you don't, if you have more questions about compliance and you don't see your compliance necessarily coming up anytime soon, we can start off with some testing, test out the environment before we get the mission critical workloads running on there, and then by that time we should be compliant in whatever your needs or your industry needs are. As we start to move into Q4 and the first half of 2020, we're starting to see more expansion into other geos, so UK, Toronto, Asia Pacific, and then start integrating other functionality like integrated disaster recovery as a service, backup as a service, including Linux on the offering, as well as to join AIX and IBM, and the other future compliances that we're looking at, SOC 2 and ISO 27001. So I'm going to kind of skip through this, Ashok, because we don't really get too far into it. But essentially, when we worked on this offering, we were looking at the different personas that touch on it, and that's why I keep bringing up our MSPs and our CSPs. AIX and IBM clients, or anybody using AIX and IBM workloads, is somebody that we obviously studied to make sure we understood their pain points. And then MSPs and CSPs are somebody that we also not only studied but also worked hand in hand to make sure we bring that functionality to the market. I'd like to talk a little bit about our business partners, especially if you're in the managed service provider or cloud service provider range. You're looking at this offering thinking, this is very similar to the value that I bring back to my clients. And I like to make the distinctions here. So similar how I said before of the bare IaaS, there's a lot of value add that our business partners bring to their customers that is not included in this offering. To run a cloud experience, a successful cloud experience for a client, it requires a lot of additional services that we as this offering team don't directly provide to the client. We can provide avenues for achieving it. It's just not something that we do as a service. So things like migration, we're not physically doing that. We do know the teams that would do it, so we can facilitate that relationship, but that is not necessarily our bread and butter. And then also backup, HA, and DR. These are all aspects that MSP and CSP clients have come to rely on their MSPs and CSPs for, and something that we don't provide back. So we propose this offering as kind of an underlaying foundation, as flexible as we're saying that our clients can be. Our MSPs and CSPs can be just as flexible with their infrastructure, spinning up instances when their clients need it quickly without having to procure additional hardware and giving that value back to their clients. So now I think I'll pass it off to Ashok. I'll talk about some of the use cases first. Sorry, I forgot about this slide. Some of the use cases that we've seen just from our beta and initial users on the offering. The first one being critical workloads, being able to move any mission critical workloads from on-prem to the cloud and having the flexibility of going back and forth. as well as testing environments. So dev and test is something that's really huge for this, just because of internally, a lot of companies, they do go through a lot of hoops to try to allocate resources for dev and test. This sort of offering being live is actually, it can really cut down the process in that as soon as you need dev and test environment, you can spin that up and run a quick dev test very, very affordably. And then also disaster recovery and disaster recovery as a service. So this is, if you wanted to have your on-prem infrastructure have a disaster recovery site in the cloud, it's a very compelling use case for our clients. While we are still working to close a lot of the functionality behind that to bring that back to our clients, it is one of our priorities just because we've heard it so much from our client base. Now I'll pass it off to Ashok where he'll go over the demo and some more technical information.
Okay, thanks. Let me start my screen sharing here.
And while Ashok is sharing his screen, just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions or comments, please post them into the chat window. I have muted all lines, so please stay muted if you're not speaking. Thanks.
Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen now, and where I'm at in my browser is cloud.ibm.com. Any of you can go to this website right now. This is our IBM Cloud platform that's been there for many years. We've used older terminology before like Bluemix, so some of you may recognize this in that context, but we don't use that term anymore. We call it the IBM Cloud. And so this is something you can go on right now. You can sign up for free. They do have the concept of a light plan, which gives you a minimal amount of free resources, like you can spin up a small Kubernetes cluster. You can create a couple of runtimes, like a node runtime. And so I encourage all of you to go ahead and sign up for this since it's for free and just play around with it. Now, our Power Virtual Server service is not free. It's an infrastructure service, and those are not given away. But at any rate, just to understand cloud and what this platform is, I encourage all of you to go to cloud.ibm.com and poke around there today. Now, when I go there, I click on catalog. That's right there in the upper right-hand corner. And that takes me to a catalog that lists nearly 200 different services here. Run the gamut from things such as infrastructure like virtual machines, firewalls, virtual routers. I mentioned runtimes like Node, Kubernetes clusters, networking devices, Watson, AI, you name it. We have it all in the catalog. But what we're interested in is going back up to the top of this catalog, Power Systems Virtual Server. So one thing to understand right away from looking at this is a first-tier service in our IBM Cloud. This is not an offering from GTS. It's not some custom hardware solution. This is our AIX and IBM VMs in our cloud proper. So there was a question earlier that Ed Weingartner asked about, can this be blended with VMware? Absolutely, and we see more and more of that in today's landscape, where we have these hybrid workloads. For example, you might see a database, a DB2 running on AIX, but a node front end that's ingesting and parsing the data running on x86. Ed asks about integrating with VMware. So all these services, up until now, this has been all x86, everything you see here. And a lot of customers already have an account with IBM Cloud. They already have an x86 side of the business consuming these services. Now that we have Power running in this same cloud platform, I can now integrate this service with that. So I will be a virtue of running in the same cloud as all these x86 services. I get that tight integration. And we'll talk more about how to actually implement that and network it in a minute. I do see some comments complimenting us on our logo, or perhaps not. I will not defend that. I will just say any questions on our logo, please talk to Jose about that, as that is something he would like to get changed. So your support is valuable there. At any rate, we click on this tile and we go to this page right here. So as mentioned earlier, We do have our service running in 2 different regions currently, the U.S. South Dallas and the U.S. East Washington, D.C. Jose mentioned in the roadmap Frankfurt, also in our future roadmap, perhaps by the end of the year, next year, London and Toronto. So we do have plans for expansion, but we're starting small and expanding as the customer demand dictates. So right now we're in these 2 regions in the U.S. Someone joined that needs to go on mute. So here on this page, you get a little bit of marketing fluff that tells you about the service, but more importantly over here is pricing. So we did include a chart on pricing, but that's just a snapshot. Things may change over time as we add more capacity, as we add different configurations. For example, right now, we have the E880 system for scale-up. And so going forward, when we move to Frankfurt, we're going to have the 980 system. When we built out these pods last year, the 980 system had not yet shipped. And so we went with the E880. But so the 980 might be priced the same as 880, may not be, that's TBD. But at any rate, what I would encourage all of you is to go to this product page and look at the prices here, but in the meanwhile, you can also use the PowerPoint slide that we included today. I mentioned earlier there was a question in the chat about why this isn't free for IBMers. Great question. That is the way the IBM Cloud works. It's not just this service, but even x86. If I wanted a Linux virtual machine, me, as a developer, I still have to pay for it. I do not get that for free. Infrastructure, which again, Jose explained earlier that what we are is not a software service, we're an infrastructure service. We are providing a virtual machine on the Power VM hypervisor. So as part of that service, since that counts as infrastructure, that is something that's charged. Now, as IBMers, we do get discounts. Now, I don't remember the exact percentage, don't quote me on this, but it may be somewhere in the 50 to 60% range. So again, you should check with one of the cloud sellers. They can probably give you a better idea, but there is an IBMer internal discount for accessing these cloud services. Also, if you're a partner or a seller and you want to do some sort of POC for a customer, there are ways to get accounts to do that in order to give free access to your clients. And you can message us later on, and I can share, at least with the IBMers, some internal pages that explain that process and how that works. Now, coming back to the pricing, what this is showing is a per hour pricing. Earlier, we talked about this is a monthly charge, but in all fairness, we meter hourly. What I mean by that is the chart we showed you how much it would cost for, let's say, a processor on an S922 system for 1 month. But today is July 24th. If after my presentation, you're so convinced to use this, you create a virtual machine, it's not fair for us to charge you for the entire month of July. You've only used it for the last week and a half of July. So that's why we actually meter every hour. Every hour we go and we check the allocation and we report it to our billing system. Now, I just used the word allocation, and that's extremely important there. The billing is not based on utilization. Those of you familiar with Power VM know that when you shut down an LPAR today on-prem, that LPAR still holds on to the resources. They are not freed up for other LPARs to use. And so it's the same model here. When I shut down a VM is inactive, it's still holding on to the storage, the processors, and the memory. So you're still going to get billed for that. So regardless of whether your VM is active or inactive, you're going to get charged. If you don't want to get charged, delete the VM. If you want to calculate how much this is actually going to cost, and you don't want to use a back of a napkin to calculate that, you can use this button here called Add to Estimate. So here what you do is you have all the different metrics that we charge for, whether you're using a processor on a scale out or scale up system, how much memory you're using, what operating system you're using. Now on the operating system, Jose mentioned that there is no such concept as bring your own license for the operating system. I'm not talking about applications or third-party software, only the base OS. We don't have a concept of bring your own license. What happens is when you order an operating system, whether you're using one of our stock images, which I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute, or you bring your own image, you have to pay for a cloud license. That's what entitles you to software support. That's what entitles you to general support. So you'll use your customer number when you go into ESS or Fix Central to download fixes. You'll use that customer number if you have an issue with AIX or IBM. We no longer have serial numbers. You're running in a cloud. So you don't know what host you run on. You don't need to know what host you run on. All you have to do is establish that you bought this cloud license for an operating system, and that entitles you to support. And we'll look at some of the contents of what is included with that license a little later when we go back to the charts. But looking over here, so there was a question about someone who's going to use a VM for a couple of minutes. So we round up to an hour. So if you use a VM for 1 minute, I don't know why you would, but let's say you did for the sake of argument, that still is going to count as 1 hour of usage. We don't have the granularity where we bill you with minutes. We don't measure minutes. So if you do 30 minutes today and 30 minutes tomorrow, that's 2 hours. We round up. Now here, this calculator is a little bit confusing. I'll admit that to you. Let's say, for example, I wanted to have a dedicated core on an S922 system. So I would just type 1 here because I want 1 processor. But that's wrong. If you see here, it says core hour. So how long do I actually plan to use this? Well, if I want to use it for the whole month, that's 30 days, and there are 24 hours in the day. So I would actually type in 720 here, as you see. So this means I want to use 1 processor on an S922 for 24 hours a day for 30 days in the month. So I would type in 722 there. So again, it's a little bit confusing. So if you understand that, you can use that calculator, or you can use the prices listed here, or I'll show you once you sign up for this service, we actually show you a much easier to understand pricing when you actually go and create a virtual machine. Now at this point, we're not creating anything. You're not getting billed anything. What we're actually doing here is we're creating an instance of the service. Some of you who have used our Power VC product may be familiar with the concept of projects, a tenant project. That's analogous to what you're seeing here. What you're doing is you're containing a project, a folder, so to speak, within which you'll have VMs. So before I create a virtual machine in DC or Dallas, the first thing I need to do is instantiate this service. I can only do this once per region. So if I create an instance of this virtual server service in Dallas, I can't create another one because, again, I'm just creating a project in a region within which I will go and create virtual machines. So this is the first step. I'm not paying for anything here, and this is not creating a virtual machine. I'm creating a project in a region, then I'll go and create virtual machines. So I'll hit create, but I won't actually do that here because I've already done this before and it'll just give me an error saying I've already have one in the region Dallas. So instead, let me go to my dashboard here. So any of you who have an account know that you can view this by going to dashboard or resource list. Let me look at the list of services I have in my account right now. I'm going to the services in my dashboard. It sounds like we have join the call. Okay, there it goes. So looking under the list of services, you see here that I actually have 2 services listed here, one in Dallas, one in DC. So again, this is that project I talked about. So I can click on either of these, and when I click on it, it's going to take me to a dashboard like this. So I'm looking right now at my instance or project in Washington, D.C. So when I click on that instance, going back here again, I just click on this right here, and it takes me to this page that's our dashboard. Now I'm actually in the service. Now I'm ready to do my VM lifecycle management. You see there's a couple of VMs already here, but I'm going to pretend that they're not there, and I want to create a new one. That's the first thing I want to do. So I'll go to provision new, and this is where I said you see a calculator here that's much more intuitive, easy to understand. where we show you what the per month charge is going to be. So you don't have to worry about how many hours are left in the month and that sort of thing like that. So the first thing I'm going to do when I create a server is I do a name. Straightforward. Then I actually get to choose how many instances I want to create. I may want to create 2 virtual machines at the same time. The reason I would want to do this is, let's say I'm creating an HA configuration, either for Power HA or Oracle RAC. So I'm going to create 2 VMs of the exact same configuration that have shared storage in this example. But since this is HA, I definitely wouldn't want those same virtual machines to be on the same host. That would be bad. So I'm going to specify a co-location rule that says put them on different servers. Then I want to be able to SSH to it. So I have an SSH key I can import. I can add a new key here. This is nice if I'm bringing my own image. I have SSH enabled. I don't want to use a console or virtual terminal. I just want to SSH to my deployed VM. I can use it for that. Now, if you're deploying a stock image, you're creating a AIX or IBM image from scratch, a password won't be set. When you install our stock AIX image, there is no password set for root. You actually have to go and set it. So you wouldn't use this SSH key with our stock image. You would use it if you're using one of your own images that you brought in. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, what I'm doing is showing you the GUI. We do have a command line for this. We also have an API for this. So if you want to do this programmatically, we have something called the IBM Cloud Command, and we have documentation right here. If you go to cloudibm.com docs, you'll find our documentation listed here. We have an API reference. We have a CLI reference that includes a link that tells you where to go and download the IBM Cloud CLI. So you have CLI, API, and GUI at your disposal depending upon which you're comfortable using. Any of you who want to use our API, of course, we all know Nigel is now an expert in Python scripting, so feel free to reach out to him to get started on API. And that is a joke. Please don't bother Nigel about this. Google it yourself.
Thanks, Ashok.
So there was a question, when we have more pod. Yeah, I don't know if that's a question or not from Jorge, but yeah, these pods that we've built out will be expandable. I think that was the question that you were asking. So we will be able to add more capacity to this. I'll talk more about that a little later when we actually talk about where these machines reside and how they connect into the IBM Cloud. But what I wanted to point out here was we also have a button or a switch here to pin a virtual server. So another thing we'll talk about later in the charts is licensing. As most of you know, licensing on Power is a pain and a half. It's very complicated, and a lot of it depends not just on IBM, but on our partners and third parties that supply softwares that run on AIX and I. Licensing is not simple. In a lot of cases, licenses actually prevent you from being able to run on more than one host. Now, in a cloud, virtual machines move around. That's why there's no concept of underlying host. We don't expose that to you. It's a cloud. Assume your virtual machine will run on any of our servers in our data center. When we need to do a planned outage, we need to, for example, update firmware on one of our Power servers, we'll have actually evacuate that host and using live partition mobility, move all the VMs to another host with capacity. If for whatever reason there's some sort of unplanned outage, let's say a host dies for some reason, we're unable to manage it anymore, we use the Power VM remote restart feature to recreate all the virtual machines on another host. So we have some resiliency mechanisms in place, but again, licensing. I may have a software license that says I can only run on one host. I do not have a license to run on any serial number in the cloud. So in that case, I would say pin is on, meaning that I cannot allow this virtual machine to move anywhere else. It has to stay on this host. Now, of course, the downside of that is a planned or unplanned outage takes your VM out with it. But again, this is probably something you're used to today when you have these types of licensing restrictions. So use this switch carefully based upon what your needs are. There's a question about POC environments. So I don't ever want to say the word free. It may be free to the customer, not so much the partner. But again, I can give you a contact Jose or myself, and we can give you some more options on this about how you can get access to this. Again, this is an infrastructure service. IBM Cloud does not give away free services, but IBMers do get substantial discounts, and there are programs to try and make it easier to do POCs for clients. So you can contact us after the meeting, and we can share some of that information with you. Now, we don't want to recreate the HMC GUI here because, again, this is a cloud. This is not meant to be hardware hosting. We want to conform to not just the IBM cloud, but other public clouds as well. So we want to keep the interface relatively simple so you're able to deploy VMs in rapid fashion. That being said, there are certain features that Power VM brings that we absolutely don't want to lose and want to capture in our user model. One of that is micro-partitioning. So you can see here that I can specify either dedicated cores or shared processor cores. I can choose to deploy, as mentioned before, on the scale-out system or the scale-up system. And as we expand into Europe and other regions, we won't be using the E880, we'll be using the E980. Now in shared processor, while we do allow micro-partitioning, we don't allow the full granularity you have today on a thing like HMC. So you cannot specify up to 0.05 entitlement. You cannot specify however many virtual CPUs you want. We do hard code the increments for shared processor in 0.25 increments. So you can allocate entitlement 0.25, 0.5, 0.75. Every 0.25 processor entitlement corresponds to one virtual CPU. So in the case I do something like 0.75, that's 3 virtual CPU. Memory, we talked about this earlier, where we have a 1:64 ratio. So for every one of these, what we do is we allocate 64 gig of memory for every one processor. When I actually mean that's the maximum. So if I assign 2 processors to a virtual machine, the maximum amount of memory I can assign to it is 128. So I can see right here, let me go to 2. You see I chose 2 processors entitlement, and now the slider for memory has a maximum of 128. So I cannot exceed that. Again, those of you who are familiar with Power VM know that we have concepts on HMC such as min, desired, and max. What's happening here is you're assigning desired. So if you want to know those concepts, under the covers, what we're assigning is half of the desired is the minimum, twice the desired is maximum. So in this configuration, what's going to happen is 1 CPU is the minimum, 4 CPU is the maximum. So later on, when we look at LPAR, what we call resize, those are the boundaries within which we can do the LPAR or resize. Now, this is when the VM is active. Again, in Power VM, for those of you familiar, when you shut down a VM, you can always change the maximum. So let's say in this example right here, I assign 2 processors, so now my max is capped at 128. Well, let's say later on I wanted to come and add more memory. I can shut the VM down, increase the number of cores, and that'll allow me to have a larger max memory. The reason, again, behind this ratio is that resource stranding Jose talked about. In this example, if I assign 2 cores and 500 gig of memory, if we didn't have this max concept, I would exhaust all the memory on an S922. So of the 15 processors, I've only assigned 2 that effectively strands 13 CPU that no one else can use because I've taken all the memory on the system for my VM with 2 cores. So again, the virtual concept is, this is in the shared processor where I said every 0.25 maps to a virtual CPU. In the case of dedicated, I can absolutely do one whole processor here, but what's going to happen is you're going to get 4 virtual CPU, not 1. There's not a way to customize that here. Again, what we're doing here is we're trying to maintain as close to a cloud model as possible. In the x86 world, they basically have 0.5 micro partitioning so that you get 2 virtual CPU for every core. So we're following a similar sort of model where we hard code the ratio here. Someone had a question about emergency access. We'll look at console access later on. You don't need network connectivity in order to access the virtual machines, but I'll show you that later when we look at an actual VM that gets created. Let's first create the virtual machine. So I've chosen the CPU and processor. Now I want to choose an image. We will provide the N and N-1 stock images. So in the case of IBM that would be 7.2 and 7.3 and whatever the latest TR is. You see here actually someone has recently added 7.4 to the catalog since that came out, I believe, a month ago. You don't have to use this. These are brand new installations. If you want to just do a kicking of the tires exercise, a dev test, a spin up day one sort of activity, you can use these stock images. But again, it's a brand new installation. More than likely, you wouldn't use this because what you're doing is you're migrating a workload from on-prem. So you already have LPARs in your data center today that you've customized, hardened in terms of security controls. You have various software applications installed on them. So you don't want to recreate all that from scratch. What you can do is there's a couple of techniques for this. One of them is you can use this custom image button. So what you can do is you can capture an image on-prem. Those of you familiar with Power VC know exactly what I mean by that. You create an OVA of the VM configuration and its disks. You take a snapshot, you get an OVA file. You can upload that to Cloud Object Storage. If I go back to my catalog right here, let me go to catalog. I'll go to storage, and there's something here that's called object storage. So in object storage, I can go and I can create a bucket in which I can store that OVA that I created. That's one possible technique there. Another thing that I can do is if I don't have Power VC, which still a lot of our customers don't have, so they won't be able to capture that OVA, there are existing backup techniques such as MakeSysB or for the IBM iCloud SaveSys. You can create those backups and copy them over to the object storage. The same cloud object storage I showed you here, you can copy that OVA from Power VC or your MakeSysB over there. In the case of something like a MakeSysB, what I would then do is I'll go ahead and choose one of these stock images. Let's say my MakeSysB is from 7.1. So I choose 7.1, and then I'm going to install that. Then what I can do is I can attach a data volume to it, and we'll look at that in a second. I can attach a data volume to this VM, and then I can copy that MakeSysB over from Cloud Object Storage, and then I can go and do a alt disk installation. Now, there was a question earlier about what patches do we include. So this was explained a little earlier that we are an infrastructure as a service. So while we provide you a base operating system, care and feeding for that operating system is the responsibility of the client. Infrastructure as a service implies all the underlying infrastructure, Power VC NovaLink, virtual IO servers, switches, our SAN storage, all of that is IBM's responsibility, our responsibility as a service provider to care and maintain. But the operating system itself, any security or patch compliance, is the responsibility of the customer, not us. We are infrastructure as a service. Now, I mentioned earlier we have a concept of resize, which is like LPAR, and we'll look at that in a minute. But that is something that the user initiates. There is no such thing as scheduled operations. So if you want to do scheduled operation, the way you would do that is from your remote client that's using command line or REST API. You would write a cron job to call that command line or REST API. Now, these images we provide here, you can bring your own, as I mentioned, and you don't even have to bring 7.1 or 7.2. You can bring whatever version you want, but understand that the support is nothing to do with the cloud, but it has to do with these models. So if there's a question about, can I bring my own 6.1 image? Absolutely. You can run whatever you want. If you're on AIX 5.3 and that's a problem you should probably look into, but let's say you're on AIX 5.3, absolutely run it. But it is not supported, and that's because of these platforms here. This has nothing to do with cloud again today. Your question on whether I can bring my own AIX 5.3 image, I would ask you, is AIX 5.3 supported on S922 or E880 today? And the answer is no, it's not. So you can feel free to bring your AIX 5.3 and run it. But if you call IBM support, and I mentioned earlier, you use your customer account number because it'll be tied to a cloud license. If you tell them you're running AIX 5.3, AIX support, the same support you would call for on-prem support today, they will just tell you, sorry, AIX 5.3 is not supported on Power 8 or Power 9. So you run at your own risk. Same with something like WPAR 5.3, not supported. By all means, if you still want to run it and you haven't upgraded, go ahead and do so, but do not expect any support because whether on-prem or cloud, you have to follow the rules of what operating system is supported there. Now, I mentioned data volume. So we have two types of storage that Jose mentioned earlier. We have our spinning disk, HDD, and we have our flash disk, SSD. The boot volume always, whether it's the stock image or bring your own, will always get deployed to an HDD. You don't have a choice there. However, if you want to attach data LUNs, there you do have a choice. So I'll click on Add, and here I can repeat this process as many times as I want. Jose mentioned that we can create data volumes ranging from sizes of 10 GB up to 2 terabytes, and we can allocate them in increments of 10 GB. I can do multiple 2 TB disks if I really wanted to. I have a choice between spinning or flash. I can make a disk shareable. If you may remember in this example, I'm creating an HA cluster. So I would want to make data volume shared so that my HA configuration has shared access to these SAN LUNs. If I had already created a shared volume earlier, I wouldn't do add, I would just say attach existing volume, and that would show me all the data volumes so far I've already defined as shareable. For networking, we have two different options, and I'll show you some diagrams after this when we go back to the PowerPoints on networking. But if I want my VM to be on a public network, so this is, again, for an example where I want to do a kicking the tires exercise, a quick dev test spin up, nothing involving production workload or any security concerns, I'll just say yes. I'll just turn this button on, and now my VM will be on a public network. And when I deploy the VM, I can find out what the external IP is. So I can go ahead and SSH to it. I can point my ACS tool to it on IBM I. But again, probably not the most secure thing to do, putting your cloud VMs on a public network. More than likely, what we're going to want to do is put this on a private network and access it. So I don't want that. Instead, I'll say add private network. And now this is where a concept of bring your own IP comes in. Cloud is an extension of on-prem. That's the way you should be thinking of cloud. So as such, the same way I can apply the configuration rules I have on-prem, I want to be able to apply those on cloud, one of which is the network space that I use. So if there's a specific range that you use for your VMs in your on-prem data center, I can type that CIDR in here. I can type the range in here. I can type in what specific IP address I want for my VM. I can create up to 8 of these network interfaces. Every one of these private networks is going to be on a separate VLAN. So if I want all my virtual machines to be on one private network, I can absolutely do so. Now, how you actually connect to this private network, we'll talk more about when we get back to the slides, but this is the option most of you would choose, is create a private network interface on here, and then you would be able to have private network connection to it. Now, I showed AIX and I didn't mention Linux. Linux support is not there yet. From a technical standpoint, there's nothing that prevents this. I can go and do a custom image right now and import a Linux image and it'll run. The problem is more about licensing. For example, we want to support RHEL and SLES. But we're working right now with our Red Hat team on the licensing model for this and how that's going to work, because do you call RHEL support directly for any OS support, just like you would call AIX and I for those operating systems? So there's some licensing issues we still need to work around. Another thing is, for power, there are no stock images. So when we support Linux, more than likely initially it'll be a bring your own Linux model, bring your own image model. There are no cloud ready images. That is, images that have cloud init, have the disk image format that Power VC can consume. Those are not distributed on Power today. So there's some work going on in that space to create those images. So there's more of a logistics question why we don't have Linux as opposed to a technical one. Now, I mentioned in this example I've created 2 VMs because I want to create an HA configuration. So this would be like Power HA. Now, any HA, and we'll talk about this more when we look at DR as a service and when we look at backup, all replication will need to be done over logical replication. That is, you cannot do something like global mirroring. The reason is that, again, infrastructure as a service. This is not hardware hosting. You don't have access to our SAN. We will never give you access to our SVC, our SAN storage, our HMCs, our Power VCs. That is not for the consumer. That is not for the partner. That is for our IBM operations team that runs this service. So any sort of storage replication that you want to do, if it requires direct SAN access, you won't be able to do that. However, things such as IBM I geo-mirroring, what do they call it, GVLM on AIX, Oracle Data Guard, these are the types of things either at the OS level or application level type mirroring or replication that is supported because it doesn't require direct access to the SAN. Now, our SAN is a V7K. I'll show you some more details on it later, but it's a V7K Gen 2. As we move into new regions like Europe, it will be a Gen 3 V7K. And I'll give some more details on that a little bit later when we go back to the charts. So this is how I create a virtual machine. Now, as we saw back on this dashboard, I already have some virtual machines created here. So let's just go to one of these and see what it looks like here. So I just click on that virtual machine in the dashboard, and it's going to spin away for a bit. One of the things I want to show you is I'm under a tab that says Virtual Server Instances. We also have tabs that say SSH keys, data volumes, boot images. So these are all global constructs. When we created the virtual machine, we had the ability to define SSH keys. We had the ability to define shareable disks. We had the ability to import images. You don't have to do that in a create VM flow. You can do this later at a global level, at your project level, and then reuse these constructs. For example, I can just go to SSH keys and import one here. Then later on, when I go to create a virtual machine, it'll show me all the SSH keys that I've defined. I can go into boot images and I can say import. And they'll ask me for my cloud object storage bucket access information. And I can import an image into my catalog here. That way, later on, when I go to do a deployment, I can just choose one of these images under that AIX or IBM I button. So this allows me to do things that might be accessed by more than one virtual machine. I can define it at a project level. Then later on, I can come and access it from the virtual machine. But back to my properties here. So I clicked on the virtual machine, and I get this VM details. Now, there was a question earlier on about how do I access this in the case of an emergency. So here we have this button here on the left right-hand side that if you, let me get that hover text again. Come on. Okay, it says open console there. So this is what you all call a virtual terminal on AIX and Linux. This is what we call a 5250 on IBM I. So I click on that button, and I'm going to get a pop-up window here that's basically the exact same thing as that virtual terminal that you all are used to. So here I am in my AIX prompt. You see here it didn't prompt me for a password because this is our stock image. So there is no password set. This is a brand new AIX installation. So I would have to, I guess, what do you guys do? Do you type, oh, I don't even know how to type. I would do, I guess, password and, okay, I give up on typing. But I would type password and I can set the root password and then I can use SSH to log into this. So this console or this 5250 is something that you can all use. Now, there's a question here about how do you do flash copy. So good question. Anything that requires SAN access would have to go through our user interface. So you see here, I'm hovering over a button that says capture and export. And I'm going to talk about this more when we talk about backup, but there's different types of backup you can do. If you want to do a flash copy based backup, that is, you just want to take a snapshot of the virtual machine and its disks, you would hit this capture button right here. And you see here, I can select what disks I want to include as part of this. By default, the boot volume will be included, but I can also include one or all, however many of the data volumes I want. I can choose, do I want this to go to the image catalog? The image catalog is this boot images section here we looked at earlier. Or, oops, let me go back there. Or I can choose to put it in cloud object storage, in which case I'm going to get prompted for my bucket information there as well. So this concept of image capture that I said our Power VC customers do is the same way that you would do a flash copy or take snapshots of disks if that's the way you do backup. Again, I was going to mention this later, but if that's too heavyweight for you, you don't want to do disk snapshot, but you would rather do file-based backup, we do support the TSM, or what I think they now call it Spectrum Protect for AIX. And someone jumped ahead of me. Thank you for that. There is a BRMS for cloud solution. So that is also something that you can use as well for you IBM I customers out there. So we have both the file-based or the VM level-based snapshotting as a backup solution. But I'll show this again. I have a slide on this later on, but thanks for asking that question. But back to my VM details. So I mentioned earlier we have the concept of resize. So I click on this pencil icon. Let's say I wanted to add more memory. I wanted to go up to 4 GB of memory from my current allocation of 2. So I can, of course, change that. And it's going to tell me this will be an additional $30 a month to do something like this. So that's processor and memory. I can also attach and detach data volumes. I can also change and modify network interfaces as well. From this same interface, I can go and stop a VM, I can restart a VM, or I can just delete a VM. So all that is allowed as well. Now we have this button here, refresh. So one thing I will say, unfortunately, this is our MVP. This is just we've only been out for a few weeks now. So we do have a couple of issues as any new product would. One of which is we don't have very good asynchronous updates of this GUI. So when you deploy a VM, you'll get a message saying VM deployed. And if you feel like I've waited 5-10 minutes and I still don't see an active VM, I see a VM that's in the rebuilds or in the build state, you can always hit this refresh button here to re-query the information. And again, this is not the most ideal solution, and we are working with the Cloud Console team on updating some of our framework to do better asynchronous updates. But it is what it is today, and this is a bit of a limitation, so you'll need to use this refresh button. Everything I explained is, again, in these cloud documents. and also what I show in the PowerPoints as well. So if you have any questions about things that I discussed, like how pricing works, I mentioned high availability, where do I go to get a license for PowerHA? So there's information here on this. It also shows the example I went through on how to create an HA pair, how to create networking, whether public or private. So all of this is in the Cloud Docs, and any of you can access this regardless of whether you're using the service or not. Okay, let me jump back into the charts because I want to talk a little bit more about some of the underlying details of the actual hardware that I used in this demo. So let me switch to my PowerPoint.
And while Ashok is switching, just a quick reminder that the replay for this session and the material from this session will be available probably not later today, but very soon as I fix my laptop. And if you have any further questions, add them to the chat window. Quite a few questions have been coming in. So thank you for that. And also, if you'd like to subscribe to the PowerVog webinar series, then send me an email. My email's in the chat window. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with networking and then we'll get to storage. So I mentioned earlier that we have this concept of public and private networking. One thing to understand is our power servers are not actually in what used to be called soft layer. So we would call all our data centers for IBM Cloud soft layer. That was a company acquired many years ago by IBM that's been absorbed into the cloud organization. Now that's been an entirely x86 business. There was an effort many years ago to put some Power 8 open power bare metal servers there, but really it's x86. And so you can't just take an E880 system and stuff it in an x86 rack. There's considerations around how we do I/O hosting through the virtual I/O server. So this answers the question of someone was asking how is storage attached. We do use NPIV. So that's not a concept in cloud. Cloud is iSCSI or network storage. There's different power consumption requirements of our power systems, the form factor, the 4U and all that stuff. So reality is it's not simple to just take our power systems and stick them in an x86 rack. So in order to preserve all the configuration our customers are used to, so the next couple of charts is I'm going to go through them quick because all they do is show you that we configure these systems the exact same way customers do today. Whether it's using redundant SCAs for networking, whether it's MPIO with NPIV, the way our systems are configured is the exact same as customers do today. And the way we're able to do that is by running these in a co-location site. So literally next door to a building in Dallas and DC and Frankfurt and London will be another building run by a partner where our power systems will be located. So how do our power systems connect back in to the x86 side? One of our original questions was, how do I integrate these power virtual servers with VMware? So there's a couple of ways here. So they're all predicated on a fiber connection called direct link. So this is an actual physical connection that runs from the co-location site back into the soft layer or IBM cloud side. And it comes in a couple of flavors. Let's start with our customer that we just call Pepsi here, the pink boxes. So we have something called a direct link dedicated. So this is a dedicated connection, a direct link that's only for our service. No one else uses this. And so for public networking, which is what Pepsi is using, the way public network traffic, ingress and egress, is routed is it first comes through this virtual router that we, IBM, as part of our service run, through that dedicated direct link to the switch in the colo, to the power virtual server. So that's public networking. Now, we don't charge for public networking. If you look carefully at the billing, there is no charge for public networking. So all the traffic that we flow over this direct link dedicated in order to get from the x86 side of cloud to the power side, we don't charge you for that. However, IBM Cloud itself, that is what we call soft layer in the middle box here, they do charge for egress traffic. So any traffic that goes out of the cloud back to this upper left-hand pink box Pepsi, egress traffic, that is charged by the IBM Cloud. It's not a charge that we power levy, it's a charge cloud does for anyone who has egress traffic. Now for private networking, that's Coke. So Coke is on a private network. So I won't be able to just have an external IP that I can SSH to since it's a private address. Instead, what I, the customer, Coke, will need to do is create a similar path that Pepsi has for public networking. So the first thing I need is a connection from the x86 side of cloud back into Power. So me as a customer, in this case with private networking, I will need my own direct link. Now, I don't need a dedicated connection. That is an option, but that's heavyweight, that's expensive, a bit overkill. There's a virtual cross circuit called Direct Link Connect. And all these direct links you can find in that same cloud catalog that I showed you, the Power Virtual Server, where I showed you Cloud Object Storage. Just search for direct link and you're going to see all these things that I'm talking about. But what you, a customer, would do is you would order a Direct Link Connect, and you can order it in bandwidths from 100 Mbps to 5 Gbps. It would go through a service provider called Megaport. And again, in the documentation that I showed you on cloud.ibm.com, all of this is explained there. So a customer would have their own Direct Link Connect virtual cross circuit, and that's what connects the x86 cloud into the Power Cloud. Megaport. And again, if you go to the documentation, you'll see all of this there. Correct, Megaport. They are the service provider for the Direct Link exchange that we use. So now that I have this Direct Link Connect between the x86 and Power Cloud, I can use that to tunnel in from outside, from on-prem, to my virtual server. So what I can do is I can actually create a virtual machine. Let's say this customer account Coke in the middle of this chart, let's say that's an x86 virtual machine I allocated. I could use that as a jump server. So I can VPN in from on-prem to that middle box, and from there use that x86 as a jump server to the Power side. Another thing is that Coke box in the middle, I could create a virtual router there. So again, I can VPN in from outside on-prem to the IBM Cloud through the virtual router over my customer-owned direct link to the virtual server. So those are two different techniques I can use to access a virtual server. Public networking, in which case I don't have to allocate anything. I use infrastructure that our service already provides, or I allocate my own route, and in which case I'm able to access my private networking. Another thing that you can do is if you have no interest in x86 at all, you don't want to come in through the existing IBM Cloud, you don't care about connecting your Power VMs to anything on x86 side, there is a way through the same Megaport provider. You would have to go directly to them, and we have instructions on this. You can directly contact Megaport and have them allocate a connection to you direct from your on-prem to the Power Colo, bypassing this middle soft layer box. That's another option to you, something you would arrange with Megaport themselves, not through IBM. And again, we do have instructions on this. Now, the minimum bandwidth for the Direct Link Connect, which is what a customer would provision to get the connection from x86 to Power, is 100 Mbps. That's the minimum bandwidth that you can order. Now, these are the charts I said I'm not going to spend time on because all they're doing is showing you the way we configure the systems is the exact same way you configure the systems. Right. So going back to this chart, let's say the earlier question the gentleman had was this customer account Coke in the middle was a VMware vCenter server that had virtual machines on it. If I want to connect that VMware over to this Coke over here at the bottom, the Power Virtual Machine, and I want to use my private networking, I will have to order a direct link connect. So this is an additional charge. In addition to the pricing information that we gave for the Power Virtual Server, you also need to calculate the price of the direct link connect and any egress data that goes out of the IBM Cloud back to on-prem. Those are additional charges you'll have to factor in. So again, back to this chart right here, we have redundant VIOSs on every host, redundant shared Ethernet adapters, nothing new here. On the hardware side, one of the things to keep in mind is these are not very large data centers initially. If you look at our capacity here, we basically have 2 880s and 8 S922s. Now, moving forward, we will build out bigger pods in our Europe regions and other places worldwide, but we initially wanted to start small to understand what the customer needs were. We didn't want to order 45 hosts and millions of dollars worth of storage only to find everyone wants Gen 3 V7K or A9000 or 9150. And so the idea was to build it, see what the initial reception is, and based off of that, add capacity and expand to other regions. So we've already talked about our region rollout plan. We also have built these up so that we can add additional capacity. If we need to replace the 880 with 980, we can do so. We can add more SAN controllers. We can add more expansion drawers of SAN. So these are extensible pods that we've built in these data centers, but the initial capacity is low. So if tomorrow you want, let's say, half a petabyte SSD storage, we don't have that right now. So that's something you'll have to bring to us, and we'll have to look at ordering that and adding that capacity in there. But that type of volume is not there at present. This is just a picture someone took when we were installing the pods in the data center. And again, this looks familiar, hopefully, to all of you, because this is the same thing that you're running in your data center. Same point on storage. So redundant fabrics, redundant VIOS, MPIO, fiber attached storage, NPIV, same thing that people do on-prem today. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about backup and disaster recovery, since there were some questions about that. So I mentioned you as a customer, as an exploiter, as a service provider, you have no ability to access our SAN directly. So what you would do is on the left-hand side right here, there's a couple of different options you can do. So one thing you can do is OS-level logical replication. So we mentioned geo-mirroring in the case of IBM. And another thing that you can do is you can use GLVM in the case of AIX. I think someone drew a line. I don't know if that was meant to indicate something or not. And I see it on my screen at least. Okay, another thing that we're going to that you could do is you can also use this same replication, not just from on-prem to cloud, but you can do it from cloud to cloud. So let's say, for example, you wanted the same logical replication between a VM you have in Dallas and one in DC. Or in the future, let's say we have 2 different zones in Frankfurt. And so we wanted you to be able to, let's say an FRA4 and FRA5, you want to have an HA configuration between those 2 zones in Frankfurt. So you can use the same technique of either OS or application-based mirroring in order to do that, either between cloud regions or from on-prem to the cloud. So here's a couple of other examples that are more at the OS or application level that you can use. I mentioned earlier Oracle Data Guard. We have the DB2 HADR. Those of you who use IBM are familiar with Mimix and Rocket iCluster. I'll talk a little bit more about licensing on Oracle in a little bit, since that always comes up. But for other things like DB2 or Mimix, in the case of Mimix, you would have to work with the company SyncSort. on licensing for that. And as I mentioned earlier, we include the cloud license for the base OS, but for licensing for any of these other application level solutions, you'd have to work with the vendor for that to understand the licensing in this cloud model. Now, backup and restore, we talked about this a little earlier. There are two different options. You can either do backup at the VM level, where you take disk snapshots and create an OVA file from it, either to your image catalog or cloud object storage. Or if you want finer granularity, you can use Spectrum Protect. Or in the case of IBM you can use this img clg command to create a backup. We also have the BRMS solution for cloud object storage. And that BRMS for cloud is something that I think came out a year or two ago, so you can Google that and find more information about that. Okay, another thing is that's replication and backup. Let's say you're migrating a workload to cloud. So replication is great. We talked about OS and application level replication, but let's say you just wanted to do an initial push of data. Again, this is dev test that I want to do on day one. For a DR as a service, then I would want ongoing replication. But if I just want to create a dev environment and I wanted to seed some database sets from my on-prem, I may just want to do a one-time push of data. So I don't want to set up geo mirroring or GVLM and all that stuff. Instead, for a one-time push of data, cloud offers this service called mass data migration. Basically, what they do is, I think it costs like $390 US, and IBM Cloud will ship you a network-attached device that can store up to 170 terabytes, I believe. So you would copy your backup of all your data to that, mail it back to IBM Cloud, and they will upload that data for you into cloud object storage. And then you can ingest that data into your virtual machine. So this is a technique you can use if you want to do a one-time push of data, is you actually use this device to ship your data. And this is a common solution you'll see in any public cloud, this device, this mass storage device. So it's not something that IBM came up with, but it's industry standard in public cloud. Now, licensing, because the two things that come up very often, one is Oracle. So earlier when I said you can pin a virtual machine, prevent it from undergoing live partition mobility or remote restarts due to licensing considerations, that's what it's really for. I really should say Oracle, but I don't want to really get into details. I'd rather keep it general, but let's just say Oracle. Now, Oracle is okay to run in the cloud because Oracle doesn't really distinguish between cloud and on-prem when it comes to their licensing requirements. The main thing that they want to see is you're doing what's called in some the documentation hard partitioning. You have capped processor allocation. So our shared processors, I mentioned you can use shared processor. That's not a good solution because that's uncapped. You don't have the ability, if you remember in the demo, nowhere there did it ask me to create a shared processor pool. All shared processor partitions go into the default pool and it's uncapped. So not a good solution if I want capping. So instead what I would do for Oracle is I would use dedicated processors because that is capped. For PowerHA, you can go to eConfig and you can get term licenses. Using your customer number. You don't need a host serial number for that. Again, this is cloud, so there's no guarantee what host you're running on. For IBM it's a bit complicated because not only do they license the operating system, but a lot of the LPPs they have are licensed as well. So here's a laundry list of all the licenses that are included as part of the base package licensing for IBM. There's no such chart like this for AIX. AIX doesn't work the same way as IBM where you get licenses for every one of these packages. So for AIX, we don't really have a chart like this. Now, the final thing I want to mention is we talked about this as infrastructure as a service. So you, the customer, are responsible for the operating system. We are working with managed application teams and IBM such as GTS. We're also working with our systems lab services as well on various offerings around this. So one of the things that you can do with your Power to Cloud credits is you can do several different types of workshops in preparation for the migration to the cloud. So, for example, a lot of customers today we see are often over allocated. They may have LPARs today that have 4 cores assigned to it, but they're only using 20% of that capacity. So you don't want to go and pay for all that unused capacity because you're wasting money in this cloud environment. So there's various engagements around planning your migration to cloud. What are you going to use cloud for? Are your VMs configured in a proper way, optimal configuration, so you don't waste money in that way? How do you migrate data over to the cloud? So the options we gave around using logical replication or the mass data migration. So there's a lot of planning workshops that our lab services team can do with you if you want to brainstorm in more depth your migration to the cloud, as well as once you're in the cloud, how do you leverage the cloud? So things such as the hybrid solutions integrating with VMware or Watson and things like that, our lab services team can help you with that. So correct, when you're using shared processors, that's uncapped. Every customer, every tenant on a host who's using shared processor for their VMs will be placed in a single default pool. We do not create separate shared processor pools for each customer. So every customer goes into the common default shared processor pool, and the shared processor entitlement is uncapped. So that is why there's no guarantee, there's no hard capping. So that means that you are going to need to use dedicated processor. So that's the end of this presentation. So we do have a few minutes left, so I'll leave it open if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Ashok, when you said using the shared storage pools there, if they had 0.75 of a shared storage pool, it would actually be spread across 3 processors, so that would be a maximum they could get to.
Right, so yeah, the virtual CPU count for 0.75 would be 3.
Okay. So they don't have to pay for the whole pool if there's 50 CPUs out there.
No. Right.
Okay.
They would just pay for 0.75. If you go to the calculator, you can type that in and see we'll actually be able to bill you for just 0.25 increments. So it's only the entitlement we bill you for, not the virtual CPUs.
Okay, but a license might be charged to the VP number.
Right.
Okay. Another question we had out there was GPFS. I assume a customer could install that, but they'd have to sort out their own licensing and support.
Right.
Okay.
Right, so there's a question about DR as a service. So again, yeah, you don't, it really depends how you plan to do orchestration. So let me go back to that slide here. So if we look over here, let's say on the left-hand side, on-prem, that's my production, and IBM Cloud I'm using for DR. So there's a couple of things that you can do. One of which is that you can create a minimal footprint VM. So let's say my production VM has 2 cores. I can create a 1-core VM on the cloud side, so I'm not unnecessarily paying for a full-blown VM, and then I can do the replication there. Now, for the actual failover, if you're not using Power HA, well, then you're going to need some other instrumentation for the failover. It may be manual or your own scripts, but if your VM goes down on-prem, then what will happen is your data will have been replicated using the logical replication, but in order to fail over any users of your services, your workloads to the cloud, that's something that you would have to instrument yourself, I suppose, if you're not using Power HA for that.
So I've been looking through the chat window, Ashok, and I think you've handled most of the questions, apart from maybe a couple at the end. If you just have a quick look at the chat window. And while you're doing that, just a reminder to everyone that I am planning some more sessions this year in the PowerVog webinar series. The next one is scheduled for 21st of August, and I will be sending out information about that session later on. It's going to be about IBM I and some new functionality related to IWS. So I hope you can join us on the 21st of August. That will be with Tim Rowe from Rochester. Okay, Ashok, there's a couple more questions come through in the chat. You see them?
Okay, I think the question here is there a way to bring your own storage? So, or SVC as software. So there is no concept of bring your own storage. You have to use our D7K storage. We won't host your own custom solution. Make this available. Okay, they're a DB2 mirror. So the DB2 mirror, I assume this is related to IBM I. I'm not too familiar with that, but this is support that came in the recent 7.4 release of IBM I, the DB2 mirror. There are plans to make that available now that we have 7.4. As we saw in the demo, 7.4 did show up in our in our boot image catalog. So the OS support is there. However, I believe this requires a specific type of FC adapter in order to peer two VMs together. So we don't have that adapter right now, and that is something we have planned for Frankfurt. So in theory, we should be able to run DB2 Mirror on I in Frankfurt. We'll have to do some hardware upgrade in our existing US-based colos in order to make this available there. Now, Mimics, as I mentioned, there's a question on that. That is supported. Okay, thank you. It looks like it's a Rocky adapter, not FC adapter, that's required for the IBM I DB2 mirror. Thank you for that correction. Again, like I said, I'm not that familiar with the feature, but thank you. So moving data back on-prem, right. So if you have that replication, that would sync your on-prem and cloud. So if Mimics was licensed for both on-prem and cloud, that would be one way you would do replication. In the case that you're not doing this active replication, let's say, for example, you did that one-time push of data using the mass data migration tool. So what you could do there is you could use that same tool to also bring data back from the cloud on-prem. But probably what I would recommend in this case is I would go this route. I would run the backup in the cloud into Cloud Object Storage and then download that backup from Cloud Object Storage to on-prem and restore it there. That's probably a pretty good way to do that, unless your image is obscenely large, like over several terabytes. Then you'd want to use the mass data migration method. Otherwise, you can use this backup method here.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions that are outstanding, Ashok. Thank you so much for, a couple more have come through, but thank you so much for delivering this session with Jose, but both of you. Thanks very much. We're coming towards the end of the time here, and questions keep coming through. So
yeah, last two questions. IBM I console, I showed that in the demo. There was that button that said Open Console, and I said this is for both the virtual terminal for AIX and Linux, as well as the 5250 console for I. So you do go back to the recording when it's posted, and you'll see that button I talked about that opens up the IBM I console. And as I've been explaining all along, this is an infrastructure as a service. So the operating system, okay, Nigel got it. Yep. The operating system care and feeding is the responsibility of the user, the owner of the virtual machine. Thanks, Nigel.
Great. Thanks to Nigel as well for fielding some of the questions and also being there at the beginning when we were testing. Okay, I think we'll call it a day today. If anyone does have any more questions, you can always ask them via myself or to Ashok and Jose directly about this offering. Thanks very much for joining, and thank you so much, Ashok. I'm just going to stop the recording.